Alright, today I'm going to do a riff on MMT, or modern monetary theory. This is a very controversial way of thinking about money, but I'll state outright from the very beginning, MMT is a great thing to learn. It will really help you to get a solid foundation for thinking about money more generally. Now, this isn't a video that's going to try to make you become an MMT supporter or some kind of MMT activist or something. It's just to give you some kind of guide to how to approach this particular topic and how to not be caught up in the bullshit attacks that people throw at it. Now, MMT is generally considered to be a left-wing theory. For example, it was associated with Bernie Sanders and Stephanie Kelton, who was one of Bernie Sanders' economic advisors. But MMT gets a lot of attacks from both conservatives, but also from left-wing people, actually. There's a lot of angst among, for example, Marxists who don't like MMT. A lot of libertarians don't like MMT. A lot of standard Republicans don't like it. A lot of Bitcoiners hate it. But what I'm going to try to show you is that actually MMT is something that conservatives do all the time. Now, the first thing to note is that MMT comes out of a particular historical context. In your early days of economics, you basically have economists who try to describe money as some kind of commodity. Basically, they start by imagining that human beings are solo individuals, and then they imagine people are struggling to trade, and therefore they quote-unquote invent money as some kind of commodity to help them trade. It's a terrible description of how monetary systems work, but back in the early 1900s, actually a particular school of thought came out called chartalism, which really tried to attack this view on money that comes out of the normal economics discipline. For example, there's a German guy called Knapp, where basically he said, hey, money is a political creation issued into existence by states. It's not some sort of spontaneous thing that just emerges out of markets. In fact, it actually is a thing that can make markets appear. And this is very, very controversial because in typical economics, they want to maintain the idea that markets are natural, just something that will just happen in any situation. But people from the economic anthropology disciplines and chartalist disciplines were saying, you know what? Human beings do not necessarily naturally trade in the way that economists imagine they do. Often, actually, what needs to happen first before you have widespread, large-scale trade is that you need these large institutions to come in and provide market infrastructure. And one of the most important pieces of that is the monetary system itself. So the state theory of money is basically coming in and saying that the state provides this monetary foundation upon which markets will then build. This style of thinking also creeps into Keynesianism and then into post-Keynesianism, and the most modern incarnation of chartalism is now modern monetary theory, which is considered to be part of the kind of more left-wing side of the Keynesian spectrum. Now, in many ways, MMT has a kind of Copernican vibe to it. If you think about Copernicus, he's this guy who comes along and says, hey, the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, it's the earth that revolves around the sun. Now, to many people living on the earth at that time, that was irrelevant. It'd be like, it feels like the sun's going around us, that's how we experience the world. And he said, well, actually, you could imagine that the sun is static and us turning around like this. So there's a change in perspective, but it doesn't necessarily fundamentally alter people's lived experience or their everyday reality. And this is sometimes what irritates some people about MMT, is it does a Copernican move where they basically say, hey, you think that you push your taxes into the government so that the government can spend for things, but in reality, that's the wrong way around. What's actually happening is that the government originally spends and then pulls the money out later through taxation. Now, for a person working in the everyday economy, that might seem like a irrelevant detail. They're like, well, I experienced myself handing tax over to the government so that the government can spend on things. But the reality is, the government doesn't need your money in order to spend on stuff because the government issues that money. Now, the best way to understand this, if you want a metaphor, is to think about oak trees and acorns. We in the everyday economy are like squirrels that try to rush around collecting money, some kind of acorn-like thing that we've got to gather up and store for ourselves. And then what we'll often do is that we'll often imagine that the state is like a giant squirrel that wants to also get acorns. In reality, the state's not like that. The state's far more like an oak tree that actually issues acorns. An oak tree doesn't want to keep or collect its own acorns. It wants squirrels to take its acorns because that's how it spreads the forest. This is a good way to think about the state versus people when it comes to money. The state wants you to take its money because when the state pushes money out, it gets resources back from society. We, though, are on the other side of that issuance, getting these units of money that are issued out by a money issuer, and then we pass those units between ourselves. And then we fantasize this idea that well, the state is like the giant squirrel that also wants acorns. The state doesn't need your money to pay for things. The state can issue money. And this is why the money itself is branded with imagery of state power on it. You know, the British £5 note has a picture of the king on it. The reality is that the state is a money issuer. The reason why the state pulls the money back is twofold. The first one is a kind of more foundational point, which is that the state uses taxation as a mechanism to create a demand for its own money. Here's a very simple example of this particular thing, right? So in South Africa, in the 1800s, lots of the Zulu and Xhosa people who were living there, they didn't need to earn money because they had subsistence systems. They had tribal subsistence economies. They weren't part of a market economy. They didn't require money. This meant that if the colonial state rocked up and said, hey, we want you to work for us and give us your labor, it had to somehow find a way to convince these tribal people to work. And the way that they did that was through hut taxes. They said to these people, the reason why you have to take these tokens that we're pushing out is that you have to give them back to us as a tax. And so you need to get them from us before you can give them back to us. And that means that these tribal people have to go and find these tokens somewhere, for example, by working for capitalists in the mining sector. And that's what gets them involved in the market system to begin with. In fact, this is blatantly spelled out in 1893 in a report from the Mine Managers Association in South Africa, in which they say, it is suggested to raise the hut tax to such an amount that more natives will be induced to seek work, and especially by making this tax payable in coins only. So this is how you incorporate people into market structures, is through the taxation system. That's how markets get catalyzed. And if markets catalyze and grow to a greater scale, the state can extract more from it. Now, the second element of why the state demands tax is to control inflation. It's not that the government is limited in the amount of money it can issue from some kind of objective perspective. It can issue as much as it wants. But it is limited in its ability to do that without degrading their own monetary system. Now, you can actually push a large amount of money into a large network of people, but there are limits to that. There's limits to the capacity of that network to actually absorb all those credits, absorb all those units. If you push too many, those credits can start to disintegrate as the actual network that the state is issuing into gets saturated by these credits. Their power gets diluted, right? And that's what's called inflation. So if they want to keep the power of the units that they issue, they have to be careful about how much they issue. States will use taxation to pull money out of circulation in order to maintain the power of the units. So it's not that the state needs your money to be able to spend, but it does need your money to reduce inflation. Now, many people, when they're attacking MMT, they're imagining that MMT is a prescriptive framework. They say, oh, what MMT is a series of prescriptions for things you should do. Now, this is a kind of bullshit way of thinking about MMT. The first thing you need to realize about MMT is that it's primarily actually a descriptive framework. So, for example, here's a water bottle. Now, if I'm describing it, I'd say it's made out of a hard plastic and it's got a stainless steel bottom. So if I was making a prescription rather than a description, I might critique this thing. I might say, well, actually, this bottle should be metal instead of plastic. I would prefer it if it had a wooden bottom. That's a prescription rather than a description. MMT is primarily a descriptive framework of how the monetary system works. But bear in mind that descriptive frameworks have a politics to them, because if you describe something accurately, it can open up the political imagination. The typical way that monetary systems are described nowadays closes down the imagination. So economists will describe money as some kind of commodity-like thing that's sort of scarce. And if you describe money like that, it shuts down your ability to think in broader and more creative ways about money. For example, you believe that money is like a scarce commodity that you have to find before you can spend it. And that naturally means you take on a more conservative orientation towards money. So in the conservative imagination, the government is described as a giant household that needs to find money before it can spend it. Now, that description is just inaccurate. It's just not a reality. The state doesn't need to take your money before it can spend itself. It spends money into existence and then later pulls it out through taxation. Now, that is a descriptive reality. That is not a prescription. Every single conservative government in the world does MMT in this sense. So when Trump is funding, for example, ICE or the border wall with Mexico, the US state is spending money into existence, pushing it into the accounts of contractors who will go and build that wall. And then as a separate act, the US can also pull money out of circulation through taxation. Now, the reason the US state does that is not because it needs the money from the tax to pay for the wall. It's to lower the amount of inflation that will happen when it's issuing new money. All governments, regardless of whether they endorse MMT or not, will always be, quote unquote, doing MMT all the time, because if you're using a modern monetary system, you're going to be using a system that MMT describes. So even if you're a conservative person, it's worth understanding what MMT actually says. Now, the reason why conservatives don't like to talk about this or don't like to use this description is that if they start to speak about the fact that the state is actually a money issuer, it starts to open up the public imagination. The public can start to say things like, you say you don't have enough money for healthcare, but you can actually issue new money into existence. You don't have to find the money. It's not some kind of scarce resource that you got to go and dig out of the ground somewhere. You can issue new money into existence. You can pay for the healthcare, subject to inflation. This is another massive mythology about MMT among conservatives. What they'll often say is that they say that MMT just advocates for endless money spending without any concern for inflation, and MMT will create massive inflation. This couldn't be further from the truth, because in reality, MMT, the only thing that people in the MMT scene care about is inflation. They'll say something like, money is not a scarce commodity, but the power of money can be diluted if you issue too much of it. So in an MMT framework, that's the only thing that matters. What they'll be looking at with the monetary system is that they'll say, forget these stories about how will we pay for things. That's not the point. The point is, does the system have capacity to absorb new money or not? But yeah, one of the reasons why it's often considered left-wing is precisely that it goes against some of those conservative austerity narratives that say, oh, we don't have enough money to spend on education. Oh, we don't have enough money to be able to spend on public services. We cannot find the money to help disadvantaged neighborhoods and things like that. And this is why actually MMT is controversial both from the right of the political spectrum and the left of the political spectrum, because traditionally in battles between left and right wing, there are often battles about levels of taxation. So the right wing will say things like, don't tax rich people so much, whereas lots of people on the left of the political spectrum will say, tax the rich so that we can spend on public services. In the MMT framework, what they will say is, well, maybe tax or maybe not. Depends on the situation. Because in the MMT framework, they'll just say, de facto, a state can spend money. Like, it doesn't need a tax to do this. It can do it. The main question is whether it needs to absorb inflation or not. If you go to an economics textbook and you ask, hey, how do governments spend money? They have these three descriptions of how governments can spend. They'll say a government has to either raise money through taxation, or a government has to raise money through borrowing, or the government can print money, just create new money. And the reality is that actually all three of those are the same thing. Whenever a government is spending, it's always creating money. It's always quote unquote printing money. The question though is it simultaneously going to pull money out of circulation to neutralize that process or not? And the two modes of neutralization are pulling it out through taxation or pulling it out through bonds in the market, pulling it out through quote unquote borrowing it back. When the US government issues bonds, it's not trying to collect money to pay for things. It's a government withdrawing its own money from circulation and then saying, we'll reissue it later to you. In the MMT framework, the bond markets will be seen as actually part of the monetary system. They're a sort of shadow element of the monetary system itself. But the basic point is that every single act of government spending is always an act of money printing. But the question is, do you accompany that with acts of money destruction as well? If you push money out while destroying money, you end up with the same money supply, but the money redistributed to a new place. If you just push new money out, you have an increase in the money supply, and that potentially can create inflation, but only if the network that you're pushing that money into has been saturated. If the network has capacity to expand, if there's people who need jobs, if there's resources that can be used, then actually pushing out new credits into society can just create economic growth. So this is very, very important to note about the MMT framework, is that it actually kind of messes with the traditional battle lines that you'll find in the left and the right. You'll often sometimes hear people saying, oh, only the US can do MMT. Other countries can't necessarily do MMT. What this basically means is that some countries have a lower capacity to make use of their own monetary system. A metaphor you might think about is, for example, a car. Now, if you're describing a car, you can say, well, it's a carriage on 4 wheels with an engine that moves around. Now, some cars have a very, very powerful engine, while others have a very, very weak engine where they basically can't even climb a steep hill. The US government, for example, is like a very, very powerful car. It has a very, very strong ability to issue money. Whereas, for example, the South African government might not have that same capacity. It has a weaker ability to use its own currency. Both of those use the same mechanisms, but one is more powerful than the other. Another quite cool thing about MMT is the fact that it just accepts the fact that capitalism is underpinned by violence. Libertarians always have this moral horror about the fact that money is backed by violence. If you said that to a person in the MMT world, it would be like going to a mechanic of a car and saying, can you believe that this car has an engine that uses fuel? To a normal mechanic, they'd be like, yeah, no shit. That's why it works. That's why it has power. That's why it is a car. Okay. And similar, if you go to an MMT economist and you was to say, oh my God, the fiat money system is backed by violence, they would say, yes, that's true. That's why it works. That's why we have modern capitalism. That's why we've got gigantic large-scale markets that spread across the entire globe. It's because we have these giant states that underpin the system. That's why we have billionaires. That's why we have large-scale corporations. It's why we have large-scale capitalism more generally, is that we have large-scale monetary systems, quote-unquote, backed by violence. It's more complicated than that because, of course, modern states aren't just a kind of warlord that's pillaging stuff. We have pacified modern states to some extent. But the reality is, yeah, sure, there's a violent underpinning to modern capitalism. That's true. MMT economists don't deny that. In fact, they're actually one of the few groups of economists who will just overtly state that. Now, I'm not saying that there are not better ways to make a car engine. So there are ways of making alternative currencies that might not rely upon violence in the same way. But it's very, very hard to make the systems work at a large scale. So, for example, when a Bitcoiner comes along and says, our system is peaceful and doesn't rely upon violence, it's like, yeah, but your system also doesn't operate as a monetary system. Your system is used as a speculative asset priced in US dollars. Nobody's using Bitcoin for everyday transactions, and there's a reason for that. Actually, Bitcoin would have a much better chance of working if it was, quote unquote, backed by violence. Part of the way to understand the libertarian or the conservative attack on MMT is to realize that MMT is kind of an attack on conservative identity, because in the conservative worldview, or at least the libertarian worldview, the way they imagine economies is they want to imagine these solo individuals who do voluntary contract with each other in markets. If you have that as an opening picture of an economy, you start to generate a fantasy of commodity money. So you ask yourself, you say, well, how do these individuals trade with each other? So they invent this idea of barter. They'll be like, well, what these solo individuals will do is that they'll start to barter with each other. And then from that, they think, okay, but barter is going to be really inconvenient. So what they start to do is they settle on a single commodity, and the single commodity will become the monetary system. And this single commodity has to have special characteristics which will serve these individuals. It must be divisible, it must be long-lasting, etc. And eventually, the libertarian imagination automatically leads to gold, and nowadays to Bitcoin. That perception of money in libertarianism comes from their starting assumption that humans are individuals. If you come from an economic anthropology background like me, you don't start from the assumption that humans are individuals. You start from the assumption that humans are intensely interdependent and cannot survive without each other. Interaction isn't voluntary. Later on, if you get to an economy that expands out, you can start to loosen those ties. You can start to feel a bit more like a detached individual. So, for example, if you're walking down the street in New York City, you're going to feel like an individual, but that doesn't necessarily mean you actually can authentically survive by yourself. Like every single thing around you is made by other people. So in the libertarian worldview, they kind of fixate on that surface level experience of being an individual in an economy, and from there generate a fantasy of commodity money, and from there generate a fantasy of like some platonic ideal of how it is supposed to be. And again, you got to remember the sort of ideological underpinnings of things like libertarianism, where often it's used as a kind of smokescreen to present capitalism as this kind of idealistic, free, peaceful, utopian system. But the way that libertarians speak about capitalism capitalism is not a historical reality. The historical reality of capitalism is that it builds out of feudalism, and it's never once in history started with some kind of level playing field without any states and with all this kind of utopian idyllic vision of individuals doing trades with each other. No way in hell. Capitalism has always been a system underpinned by violence. It's always been this cronyistic system. It's always had state underpinnings. So in many ways, the libertarian description of how capitalism quote unquote should be is a fantasy. And sometimes it's a naive fantasy. Sometimes it's a cynical fantasy. Sometimes it's used to actually disguise or whitewash what's happening in capitalism. All right, this has been a free-form exploration of the MMT movement or the modern monetary theory movement. Put your questions in the comments below and I can try to answer some of your queries or concerns. Thanks for listening and see you next time.